In the gilded courts of ancient Persia, purity was not a virtue, it was a sentence. Behind jeweled curtains and perfumed halls, royal women were examined, judged, and condemned in the name of the gods. What began as sacred ceremony became an instrument of domination, the first virginity tests of the empire. Tonight, history opens its most sealed chamber, where faith met flesh, and where the price of perfection was written in blood. In the 5th century BCE, when the empire of Cyrus's heirs stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, the doctrine of purity ruled the private life of the court. Every alliance, every birth, every coronation began with a ritual designed to please the goddess Anahita, patron of water, chastity, and divine cleanliness. In the eyes of the priests, a woman's untouched body was proof that the gods still favored the throne. To doubt her purity was to doubt the stability of the empire itself. Within the high terraces of Persepolis, the ritual chamber stood apart from the grand halls of ceremony. No men entered except the highest magi. Walls of alabaster reflected lamplight like the inside of a shell. Incense drifted in pale spirals, masking the odor of oil and fear. The women who served there were chosen as keepers of holiness, sworn never to marry, never to speak of what they saw. They called the place the House of Anahita, but among concubines and attendants, it was whispered as the White Room, a name born from the color of the stone, and from the faces that left it drained of blood. When a noble girl was pledged to a royal marriage, she was taken first to the White Room. She was bathed in cold milk and rosewater, her hair combed until her scalp burned. The priestesses recited verses that spoke of rivers, of purity flowing unbroken from heaven to earth. The girl stood naked before them, trembling, while they touched her abdomen, her thighs, her chest, claiming that the pulse beneath their fingertips revealed truth or deceit. No blood was drawn, no instrument used. Yet humiliation itself was the weapon. The inspection ended when the eldest priestess lifted a bronze mirror to the girl's face and whispered, "The goddess sees." If she cried, it was taken as confession. For the court chroniclers, these rites symbolized sanctity. Their tablets praised the emperor's devotion to divine law. None recorded the faces of the women who endured it. The ritual's cruelty was invisible because it was ceremonial, wrapped in prayer and perfume. Even the victims believed at times that pain was the language of holiness. Such faith was the empire's most perfect chain. But among the attendants, disquiet began to stir. One woman, her name lost to history, noticed that the goddess demanded silence only from the shamed. She saw how the priest's hands lingered, how purity changed its meaning with each generation of rulers. When her own daughter was chosen to serve the next inspection, she refused to send her. That defiance, small and wordless, became the first crack in the marble doctrine. By dawn, the empire still slept in golden calm. The priests washed their hands in sanctified water. The girl they had examined lay wrapped in silk, her eyes fixed on the ceiling's painted stars. Outside, a wind from the desert carried the faintest murmur of rebellion, a sound too soft for chronicles, yet strong enough to survive centuries. Beneath the veil of piety, the first question had been asked: who decides what purity means? And why must women bleed to prove it? By the reign of Darius II, the ritual of purity had hardened into law. What had begun as whispered ceremony within the White Room now extended into every noble household of the empire. No woman could be wed, crowned, or brought into the royal harem without first proving her untouched state. What the priests once sensed through divinity, midwives were now ordered to verify through evidence. Faith was no longer enough. Blood became the empire's chosen witness. Records from the royal archive describe a noble bride named Irdabama, pledged to a governor favored by the king. She was known for her beauty and education, qualities praised in public but privately feared. Her wit drew the attention of men who would rather see her silenced than powerful. On the eve of her wedding, 2 midwives and a temple physician arrived at her quarters carrying baskets of linen, bronze bowls, and thin reeds wrapped in silk, the instruments of inspection. The court chronicler called it a ceremony of verification. But there was nothing ceremonial about it. The girl was laid upon a marble slab, her wrists bound with threads of gold, so that her purity could not resist its own proof. The attendants murmured verses, dipped the reeds in oil, and declared that the gods would guide their hands. What followed was neither medical nor spiritual. It was a quiet cruelty performed with precision. When the cloth they used returned unstained, one of them hesitated. The chief midwife demanded more proof. They pressed again. This time, the evidence appeared, a spot of red upon white fabric. The priests proclaimed her clean, untouched, worthy of the divine blessing. The ceremony was complete, and the empire's law satisfied. But the girl did not rise. The chronicler's record ends there, cold and unfinished. Yet other scrolls speak of her fainting, of fever, of silence lasting 3 days. In the banquet hall above, the satrap celebrated his new bride's purity, unaware that she would not live to see her wedding night. Her attendants carried her body away before dawn, claiming she slept. When asked about the ritual, the high priest declared, "The gods have accepted her sacrifice." The phrase entered the imperial lexicon, a convenient way to describe death without guilt. The following years saw the practice expand under that same justification. The royal physicians began to design procedures, claiming scientific accuracy. Cloths were catalogued, blood noted in tablets, and a new office was created, the Inspector of Purity. Men of medicine now served as executioners cloaked in reason. Each test demanded a witness of rank, ensuring no woman could accuse her examiner of sin. It was during this period that rumors began spreading through the slave quarters, of women mutilated to guarantee success, of concubines who harmed themselves to avoid testing at all. Fear became its own ritual, renewed with every marriage contract. Yet for the empire, these sacrifices were invisible. Only one record hints at dissent, a physician's note preserved in a clay fragment. He wrote, "The law demands proof where no man would bear it himself." His name, too, was erased from every later document. The marble chamber was washed, the reeds replaced, and the empire moved forward as though nothing had happened. But within that silence, a seed had been planted, the realization that virtue in Persia had been rewritten as suffering. In the eyes of the court, the first blood was not tragedy. It was evidence. And from that evidence, 1,000 more wounds would follow. By the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era, the ritual of proof had evolved into an institution. No longer confined to palaces or private chambers, it became part of the empire's machinery, formal, recorded, and profitable. From Persepolis to Susa, the state built inspection chambers beside temples, sanctified by law but run by accountants. They called it the House of Purity. In its ledgers, women's names appeared beside numbers and symbols, as though their bodies were mere transactions of faith. Each region was assigned a supervisor, often a eunuch or aging physician, whose duty was to report on examinations and collect the taxes attached to each one. The fee was paid by the family of the bride or concubine, supposedly to cover the cost of linen, oil, and ritual maintenance. But the real cost was far greater. Every entry in those scrolls recorded not just the woman's name, but her humiliation, measured, dated, and sealed with the priest's mark. The chambers were identical across the empire. A single window near the ceiling, a light to fall upon a marble table. The air reeked of incense meant to disguise the scent of oil and blood. At dawn, lines of girls waited outside the gates, noble daughters, slaves, captives of war, each clutching a small token or prayer scroll. For some, it was their first entry into womanhood. For others, their final act before being sold to the harem. The guards referred to them not as women, but as subjects, each assigned a number carved on thin clay discs. Within the chamber, the process unfolded with mechanical precision. The inspectors recorded the results, passing tablets to scribes who inked the outcomes onto imperial parchment. If the woman passed, her token was returned with a red seal, and she was allowed to proceed with her marriage or service. If not, her name was marked in black and sent to the clerics for further inquiry, a phrase that often meant disappearance. Deaths were common but unacknowledged. Infections spread quickly in the confined rooms, and the same instruments were reused endlessly, their oil darkened by the residue of countless others. Midwives began to whisper warnings, and families bribed officials to avoid the ritual altogether. But for the poor and enslaved, escape was impossible. The law required documentation. Without a sealed certificate of purity, no woman could marry, inherit, or even be buried in sacred ground. Among the records discovered centuries later, one document stands apart: the testimony of an unnamed midwife. Her confession describes nights spent washing the bodies of girls who had died under examination. She writes of her trembling hands as she signed their names into the register, knowing each mark condemned them twice, once in life, once in memory. "The ink is heavier than the blade," she wrote, "and my name sits beside theirs in shame." As the House of Purity expanded, it became a bureaucratic labyrinth. Inspectors competed for favor, priests sold exemptions, and nobles manipulated results to discredit rivals. The purity of women became currency, traded, taxed, and weaponized. What began as a spiritual rite had become an industry of control. And yet, beneath the empire's immaculate record-keeping, another story lingered, that of the midwives, the only witnesses to both the suffering and the silence. Each signature she placed on the imperial ledger was an act of quiet rebellion, a prayer written in ink rather than voice. The final lines of her confession read, "They say the gods demand proof. One say proof has devoured the gods." The House of Purity continued its work for another century, its floors polished, its ledgers full, a monument to the empire's belief that sanctity could be counted, signed, and sold. By the time Artaxerxes II took the throne, the House of Purity had become more than an institution, it was theater. What had once been whispered in hidden chambers was now staged before courtiers, presented as proof of divine justice. The emperor's scholars called it the ceremony of assurance, a spectacle meant to show the ruler's moral authority over his subjects. But beneath the fragrance of myrrh and the gleam of gold, the rite became something darker, a ritual of possession. The emperor demanded to see what others only recorded. From behind a curtain of silk, he would observe the examinations of brides offered to his generals or governors. The officials claimed it was to ensure fairness, to eliminate deceit. In truth, it fed a hunger for control, the need to see purity not as virtue, but as submission. The more women stripped of dignity before him, the more divine his rule appeared. Chroniclers describe one such ceremony in the fortress city of Ecbatana. The hall was lined with banners bearing the emperor's sigil, and the floor glistened with polished obsidian. A dais was erected at the center, and before it stood the inspectors, clad in white robes embroidered with silver flame. The chosen woman, a concubine promised to the satrap of Media, was brought forward blindfolded, her wrists bound with silk cords. When she knelt, the emperor's shadow fell over her like a blade. The inspection began under the pretense of purification. Oil was poured upon the marble floor. Incense filled the air. The woman's name was spoken aloud, then erased by the priest who declared her identity irrelevant before the god-king. As the examiners performed their sacred duty, the emperor raised his hand, and musicians began to play. The sound of flutes drowned the woman's cries, turning pain into performance. When the examination concluded, a mark was pressed into her shoulder, a faint burn shaped like a sunburst. It symbolized acceptance, yet all present knew it was a brand. Those who bore the mark were permitted into royal service. Those who resisted were cast into the house of silence. a prison beneath the temple where women were kept until they repented. The chronicles record hundreds of these markings, their number growing with each festival of purity. Witnesses wrote that the emperor's expression never changed. He neither smiled nor frowned, neither praised nor condemned. His stillness was mistaken for divine wisdom, yet it was something colder, fascination stripped of empathy. The ritual, once sacred, now served as a mirror of his power, the ability to destroy and sanctify in the same gesture. The effect spread through the empire like fever. Nobles began hosting their own viewings, each eager to mimic the emperor's righteousness. Women became spectacles, their virtue proven not in privacy, but in humiliation. The empire's poets began to write verses celebrating the illumination of truth, as if suffering were sunlight. Yet, even in that darkness, resistance stirred. In secret corners of the House of Purity, midwives whispered prayers to forgotten goddesses, protectors of the unseen. They began marking the bodies of the condemned with invisible oils, sigils that faded under flame but carried meaning. You are still whole. The emperor never saw those hidden signs. His gaze, fixed upon the surface of obedience, mistook silence for faith. But the women who endured his ceremonies carried another kind of witness, one not written in ink or blood, but in the memory of every trembling hand that dared to survive. The emperor's reign would be remembered as one of great splendor and stability. Yet beneath its marble foundations, the empire's women bore scars shaped like the sun, a reminder that the light of kings can also burn. When power grows tired of proving itself, it learns to accuse. By the reign of Artaxerxes' successor, the virginity test was no longer a sacred assurance. It had become a weapon sharpened by envy and fear. Within the palaces of Persepolis, purity was currency. And like any currency, it could be counterfeited, spent, or stolen. The most infamous case recorded in the imperial annals concerned Lady Atossa of Susa, a noble woman whose intelligence rivaled that of the king's ministers. Her beauty made her beloved. Her influence made her dangerous. She advised her husband, a general favored by the emperor, on matters of war and tribute, and in doing so, drew the quiet resentment of men who found her voice intolerable. A whisper began, "Atossa is impure." It started in the women's quarters, planted by a jealous concubine, and reached the priests within a week. By law, such an accusation could not be ignored. The inspectors of purity summoned her for examination. She protested as a married woman of years, but the court decreed that impurity can occur after marriage, through hidden sin. The accusation, though absurd, gave her rivals what they needed, a stage. The examination would be public, in the presence of priests, courtiers, and her enemies disguised as witnesses of truth. The emperor himself approved the decree, perhaps curious, perhaps indifferent. The day arrived beneath a sky heavy with dust. Atossa entered the chamber veiled in crimson, her dignity held like armor. The midwives prepared the instruments, but the chief inspector, a man named Argovana, halted them. He announced that divine guidance was unnecessary, that her guilt was self-evident. The crowd gasped, but no one intervened. The cloths and reeds remained untouched. The test was performed only through words, a recitation of supposed sins, false confessions drawn from forged witnesses. Atossa was accused of lying with her husband before their marriage, of concealing her impurity with herbs. Each charge was accompanied by murmurs of approval. The outcome had been decided long before she entered the room. When she refused to bow her head, the priests declared her defiled. Her husband's estate was seized, his name struck from royal rolls. She was paraded through the court as an example of divine judgment, her veil torn away, her silence twisted into proof of guilt. The crowd chanted prayers while the emperor's scribes recorded her disgrace. That evening, she was exiled to the desert outskirts of Susa, her body marked with ash as a warning to others who might rise above their station. But the truth did not die with her humiliation. a midwife named Dura, who once served in the House of Purity, later confessed under oath that no examination had ever occurred, that Arduvana had received golden land from one of Atossa's rivals before delivering his verdict. His name, too, vanished from the imperial tablet soon after. From that day, the virginity test was no longer merely ritual, it was politics. Queens, concubines, and noble daughters learned that purity could be stolen by decree. Accusations became tools of succession, weapons to eliminate wives, rivals, or even heirs. The House of Purity, built for sanctity, had transformed into an arsenal. The same reeds that once trembled in the hands of priestesses now pierced reputations with invisible wounds. In the empire's eyes, a woman's body had become the battlefield, and her purity, the empire's most convenient lie. And somewhere in exile, Lady Atossa's story lived on, whispered in the dark by women who understood that in Persia, truth bled quietly and guilt needed no proof at all. By the later years of Artaxerxes' reign, the House of Purity had turned into a place of quiet terror, a building so feared that mothers whispered its name to frighten daughters into obedience. The marble floors, once gleaming from ritual oil, now reeked of iron and incense. Inside, the air held the weight of secrets too heavy for gods to bear. It was in this atmosphere that the story of two sisters from Hamadan took shape, a tale of devotion twisted into tragedy. The elder Sarah had been chosen for testing after rumors of her engagement to a nobleman reached the palace. She was to be examined before her union could be sanctioned. Her younger sister Nisa, frail and timid, could not endure the thought of her sibling being defiled in the name of piety. On the night before the test, while attendants slept, Nisa made a choice that would etch her name into Forbidden's legend. She veiled herself in Sarah's wedding garments and took her sister's place at dawn. The guards, unaware of the switch, escorted her to the House of Purity. The priests recited their prayers, unaware that the trembling beneath the veil came not from guilt, but from fear of discovery. The chief inspector, a man schooled in the art of reading silence, watched her closely. His task was no longer to find impurity through evidence, but to sense it through demeanor, through averted eyes and quivering lips. When Nisa failed to respond to the opening invocation, he stepped closer. "The pure do not tremble," he said softly, circling her. "Only the stained fear the gaze of truth." His words were ritual, but his eyes sought confession. The girl kept her head low, her tears falling onto the marble floor. The sound betrayed her. Her sobs, small and quick, were unlike Sarah's calm composure known among the attendants. The priest's suspicion deepened. He ordered the blindfold removed. When the fabric fell, the chamber fell silent. Recognition dawned. He did not cry out. Instead, he smiled faintly, as if the gods themselves had orchestrated a test within a test. "You are not she who was summoned," he said. "And in deceit, you have confessed impurity by your own trembling." The punishment was immediate. The elder sister was spared, officially declared untouched by divine intervention. But Nisa was condemned, not for sin, but for deceit against the sacred order. She was branded with a mark across her shoulder, the sign of the defiled, and cast into the house of silence. The empire called it justice. The sisters called it devotion. For years, the record of the substitution circulated in whispers. Some said Nisa's act became an unspoken rebellion, that her silence inspired midwives to question their own complicity. Others believed the priests used her case as proof that emotion itself could betray impurity. "Even if the body lies," one tablet reads, "the soul will tremble." From then on, inspectors were trained not only in examination, but in the reading of breath, pulse, and tears. A psychology of holiness turned against its own victims. When Nisa died in confinement, her body was quietly buried beyond the temple walls, unblessed and unnamed. But among the attendants, she became a saint of the unseen, the girl who failed her test by loving too deeply. The ritual continued, colder than before. Where once they had searched for blood, Now they searched for fear. And in the empire's cruel arithmetic, trembling had become proof enough. In the decades that followed Nisa's martyrdom, whispers of rebellion began to trouble the House of Purity. Some midwives vanished, others were accused of forging results. The priests, fearing collapse of authority, turned to a new form of divine verification, one that no mortal could dispute. They called it the trial of Ahura's fire, claiming that flame itself would expose deceit. But beneath the sacred pretense lay desperation, an empire grasping for obedience through terror. The chronicles describe the first recorded ordeal taking place during the reign of Artaxerxes III, in the courtyard of the fire temple at Pasargadae. It was said that the accused, a noble woman named Rhodogyun, had been charged with impurity and treason, a combination designed to destroy both her body and her lineage. Her alleged crime was refusing the advances of a royal envoy. To cleanse her name, she was ordered to undergo the fire test, to walk across heated coals before the gathered court. If she emerged unburned, she would be declared pure, protected by Ahura Mazda himself. At dawn, the ceremony began. Hundreds gathered as priests traced holy symbols in ash upon the stones. A path of glowing embers stretched 10 paces long, each coal red as a dying sun. The woman was stripped to her linen robe, her wrists bound loosely with thread. Not to restrain, said the priest, but to remind her of divine judgment. The air shimmered with heat. The emperor's officials stood behind curtains of bronze, their faces hidden but their power undeniable. When Rhodogyun stepped forward, her bare feet met the coals with a hiss. Witnesses recorded that she did not scream, not once. She walked slowly, eyes closed, lips moving in prayer. But when she reached the final step, she collapsed. The priests rushed forward, declaring that the gods had accepted her sacrifice. Her body was burned beyond recognition, yet the court proclaimed her pure. That evening, the decree spread across the empire. Fire does not harm the innocent. It was a sentence designed to sanctify suffering. Soon, the ordeal became common punishment for accused wives, courtesans, even servants. Some were made to touch heated iron. Others forced to hold burning oil in their palms while reciting prayers. Survival became proof of virtue, pain became scripture, and ashes became law. Foreign envoys from Babylon and Greece wrote astonished accounts of these trials. One noted, "They seek truth not in word or deed, but in agony." Physicians who objected were silenced or exiled, accused of impiety. Those who remained learned to treat burns in secret, smuggling healing salves beneath temple robes. Over time, even the fire grew weary of its burden. Too many women died, too few survived. But the priests could not abandon what they had proclaimed divine. When the emperor's favorite concubine perished in the ordeal, the court merely redefined the outcome. Her death was proof of her loyalty beyond flesh. The fire of Ahura continued for 30 years. It devoured hundreds and purified none. In the imperial archives, it was remembered as an age of faith renewed. In the whispers of the women, it was called the season of smoke. And though the flames were eventually extinguished, their echoes remained, the smell of charred offerings seeping into the marble of every palace, every shrine. For in Persia's desperate search for purity, even the gods themselves had become executioners. When the fires finally dimmed, the empire sought gentler ways to prove virtue, or at least to appear gentler. The rituals of flame had scorched more than bodies. They had burned away belief. Whispers rose among courtiers that the gods had grown weary of such cruelty, and that perhaps purity was not measured by endurance, but by devotion. Yet beneath that pious language lay fatigue, fear, and guilt, emotions the priests could not command. It was during this slow decay that Queen Mandana, consort to the aging Artaxerxes, began her quiet rebellion. She was not remembered for beauty, but for precision, her mind sharper than any blade in the court. She read the archives, studied the tablets, and learned how purity had been turned into mathematics, names, seals, ledgers, signatures. What the priests declared divine was, in truth, paperwork. And what could be recorded, she reasoned, could be altered. The first act of mercy was small. A young bride from Ecbatana, accused of impurity after her test showed no blood proof, was brought before the palace. Mandana read the report herself and noticed the seal was faint, a mark easily forged. That night, she entered the chamber of records, pressed her ring into hot wax, and stamped a new verdict, pure by divine decree. The girl was released. The priests never learned. Over the next months, Mandana built a secret network, scribes, midwives, and attendants who shared her disgust with the ritual. Together, they cleaned stained cloths, altered ink dates, and swapped names across lists. Each forged line was an act of defiance. Each erased signature, a prayer for mercy. They called it the soft revolt, for no sword was drawn, and yet the risk was death. The House of Purity began to show inconsistencies. Too many perfect results, too few condemned. Priests whispered of divine forgiveness, while administrators noticed the irregularity in their ledgers. Some called it miracle. Others called it corruption. Mandana said nothing. She continued her work even as the weight of secrecy grew unbearable. But no rebellion, however quiet, escapes the eyes of power forever. One winter morning, a clerk named Ostens, desperate for favor, discovered the hidden ledger, a single volume filled with unnatural blanks. Entire names missing, seals mismatched, cloth samples unstained where stains had once been recorded. He delivered it to the High Inspector, claiming the Queen herself had rewritten the laws of purity. The investigation was swift. The priests assembled, the Emperor summoned. Mandana stood before them, her face calm as stone. "If mercy is treason," she said, "then the gods are traitors first." No one answered. The chamber fell silent but for the scratching of quills recording her words. The sentence was not immediate. She was too beloved, too essential to condemn openly. Instead, she was confined to her quarters under the guise of illness. Her attendants were dismissed, her records seized. Many of the women she had saved were quietly summoned back to be retested. Some vanished entirely. Yet her actions could not be undone. The forged documents had already circulated across the provinces, copied by sympathetic scribes. The empire's foundation of sanctified cruelty had been cracked, subtly, invisibly, by a queen's deliberate ink. From that moment on, every verdict of purity bore a shadow of doubt. Even the priests began to question whether the gods themselves could tell truth from forgery. The empire called it heresy. The women called it hope. The queen's silence became its own scandal. Months passed with her secluded in the western wing, her voice forbidden in council, her letters intercepted. Yet beyond the marble walls, her name grew in whispers. They called her the unbroken veil, the woman who had deceived the gods and lived. To the priests, she was a blasphemy made flesh. To the women of the court, she was something far more dangerous, a symbol. When the empire began to fracture under drought and rebellion, the priests sought a single offering to restore divine favor. Their choice was deliberate and cruel. If purity was the cornerstone of order, then the queen, accused of defiling it, must herself be tested. It was not justice they sought, but spectacle, a re-sanctification through her humiliation. The ritual chamber, once used for nameless maidens, was transformed into a stage. Curtains of white silk hid the tools of inspection. The priests wore robes blackened by soot, symbols of sin they claimed to purge. Mandana was led barefoot through the corridor of witnesses, nobles, courtiers, foreign envoys, each pretending to avert their gaze, yet unable to look away. She refused the veil. "If the truth fears the eyes of men," she said, "then it is not truth." Her voice, calm and stripped of grandeur, filled the hall like an oath. The high priest recited from the Book of Purity, demanding confession. Instead, she asked for a mirror. When they brought one, she studied her own reflection and whispered, "I see no God here, only men pretending to be his voice." The inspection began. The physicians hesitated, terrified of touching the queen, while the priests urged them forward. Mandana stood unmoving, her face devoid of fear, her body marked only by the symbols of her station. The air grew thick with unease, not because of the act itself, but because she refused to flinch. Her stillness mocked their power. When the priest commanded the symbolic incision, the same that had shamed countless others, she refused. "No man will draw blood in the name of my chastity," she declared. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a heartbeat, the ritual faltered. The script had no line for defiance. The crowd murmured. A few women wept quietly. The emperor, aged and trembling, rose from his seat. "You would destroy the empire for your pride?" he asked. "For my soul," she answered. "And for theirs." That was the moment the illusion broke. The priests, enraged, declared her impure by refusal, the highest blasphemy. But something in the hall had shifted. No one cheered, no one bowed. Even the guards hesitated, their swords half drawn. Mandana, stripped of title and protection, had done the unthinkable. She had refused to be shamed. They carried her away that night. Some say she was executed in silence. Others claim she was sent to a remote temple to die forgotten. Yet weeks later, a parchment circulated through the capital, her handwriting unmistakable. It read, "You cannot sanctify cruelty. Every wound inflicted for purity will one day bleed through the crown that ordered it." The empire tried to destroy every copy, but her words survived, carved secretly into doorframes and whispered in the chambers where women still awaited inspection. The queen's test had not proven her guilt. It had proven the gods were never watching. The house of purity was sealed under imperial decree before the year's end. Its gates were chained, its fountains drained, and the white curtains, once symbols of sanctity, were burned in the palace courtyard. The emperor, grief hollowing his face, declared the ritual abolished in accordance with divine mercy. Yet mercy, once corrupted, does not die easily. The people watched as priests were stripped of their titles, their books confiscated, their temples shuttered. But what was written upon a soul cannot be erased by decree. The city moved on, outwardly cleansed, yet beneath its surface, the old faith clung like a ghost to the bones of its people. The queen's disappearance became a forbidden subject. To speak her name was to invite suspicion. Mothers warned their daughters not to whisper rebellion, lest the gods mistake courage for impurity. The house of purity rotted in silence, but the rituals it had birthed began to breed in secret. In the countryside, where no royal guards patrolled, the old rites resurfaced under new names. Villagers spoke of the threat of fire, the stone witness, the breath of ash. Each was a distorted echo of the virginity test, repurposed by fear. Wrapped in superstition, passed down through the tongues of midwives and matrons. Some claimed it ensured fertility. Others said it warded off demons. But beneath every justification lay the same wound, a need to control the female body, disguised as divine order. Midwives carried the memory of the queen like contraband scripture. They whispered of her defiance while heating irons or weaving ceremonial cloths, teaching girls to endure pain in silence. The empire's men forgot the ritual. Its women never could. In them, the fear became inheritance. Guilt passed from mother to daughter, a lineage of quiet endurance. Generations later, when new dynasties rose and languages changed, the house of purity crumbled into ruin. Its marble pillars were scavenged for temples, its inscriptions eroded by sand. Only one chamber remained intact, the inner sanctum where the tests had taken place. In the late centuries, an archivist uncovered it during restoration. Beneath the dust and broken mosaics, he found a box of cedar, sealed with wax and marked by a single sigil, a woman's eye encircled by a thread of gold. Inside lay parchment after parchment, each stained with age and inked in a hand both refined and trembling. It was Mandana's journal. She had recorded the names of the tested, every maiden, every widow, every mother accused, examined, or condemned under the guise of purity. Alongside each name she had written a line: she was more than what they saw. Some entries ended abruptly, others in smudged tears. At the bottom of the final page was a note, a sentence meant for no audience, yet destined for all. If they call this the price of purity, then it is not the women who are impure, it is the empire. The archivist, moved to silence, replaced the journal where he found it. Decades later, a traveler would stumble upon the ruins and find a fragment of that same line carved into stone. It was the last remnant of the House of Purity, not a shrine to the gods, but to the forgotten daughters of an empire that mistook cruelty for faith. And in that silence, their names were finally heard.